Hi everyone, welcome to the CSI UWA webinar series. My name is Leanne Lester and I'm the Research Manager here at CSI UWA. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge the Whadjuk Noongar people, the traditional custodians of the land on which we are situated. I pay my respects to their elders past and present and acknowledge their continuing connection to country, culture and community. Our seminar today is titled, Does Disability Reshape Who We Are? New Evidence on Personality Change Following Permanent Disability Onset. Personality traits shape the decisions we make, the jobs we hold, and the lives we lead. Economists and psychologists have long assumed that these traits are relatively stable across adulthood. But what happens when a major life event permanently changes the way we can participate in work, social life, and daily activities? Our speaker today is Associate Professor of Economics at the UWA Business School, Michael Palmer. Michael's research is concentrated on the economics of health and disability in Australia and the Asia-Pacific region. He has published widely on disability measurement, labour market participation, poverty and social protection. Michael teaches courses in health and experimental analytics and has received awards for excellence in postgraduate teaching. He is a member of the NDIS Evidence Advisory Committee, Economic Subcommittee, and collaborates extensively with researchers, governments and international organisations on disability policy and evaluation. Before we welcome Michael, I'd just like to let everyone know that we'll be taking questions at the end of the presentation. Please feel free to post your questions in the chat throughout the session or raise your hand at the end and we'll address and answer as many as we can. Over to you, Michael.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Leanne, and thanks for the invitation from the Centre of Social Impact at UWA. So it's a great pleasure to present our work today. I'll just share my slides if you bear with me for a minute. So everyone can see. So this is new work. First time we've presented the work, so we're really grateful for the opportunity today, and thanks everyone for joining. As Leanne mentioned, we'll have quite a bit of time at the end, hopefully, to discuss, and yeah, it'd be great to hear your feedback on the paper and get some thoughts and comments on how we can potentially improve it. So as the title suggests, so we're looking at the impact of personality change following permanent disability onset. Some new evidence using longitudinal data from Australia. It's joint work with Samir Badji from Monash University, Gang Chen from the University of Melbourne, and Dennis Petrie also from Monash University. I'm obviously here at UWA. Okay, so the motivation for this paper started actually with a family member of mine who developed a terminal illness, and we just witnessed how his personality changed over time, and so that sort of led me to this research topic today. And as I began to read more and more around this area, reading extensively on the psychology literature and also the economics literature, it's been looking at the role of personality across the life course, and also how personality traits and also other non-cognitive skills impact on life outcomes. There was sort of a general view in the literature, I don't know if I can turn this off, all these people waiting in the lobby, that traditionally, personality is seen to be largely fixed. So certainly by adulthood, so by the age of 30, it was sort of seen to be plastered on. So general sort of traditional views around personality was that changes occurred in sort of early life, early adulthood, and by the time we reached sort of mature ages of middle age, that our personalities were fairly fixed and stable over time. And certainly that's how personality is treated within my field, within economics, where these are often treated as sort of predetermined inputs, and put on the right-hand side of a regression equation, with the view that these are largely sort of unchanging over time. But there is sort of an emerging body of evidence showing that, that personality does change over time, over the life course. And can also change depending upon your environment and the roles that you undertake. So this is sort of the literature that we'll be contributing to, how different life events can really shape one's personality. And why does this matter? Because there's quite a large literature now showing that personality traits and non-cognitive skills are very, very important to schooling outcomes, employment outcomes, including wage, health outcomes, even crime, and longevity. So there's quite a large literature looking at the impact of personality on a whole range of economic and social outcomes. And these effects are not trivial, and in some cases are even greater than sort of ability and cognitive-based measures. So that's kind of the motivation for the paper. And a lot of this work is sort of looking at these sort of what we call the big 5 personality traits. So a lot of the empirical work is looking at the relationship between these 5 traits. And each trait is actually an aggregation of a lot of different personality measures. But broadly speaking, there are these 5 traits labeled as extroversion, which sort of captures your level of sociability, your energy, your positive affect, your assertiveness. Agreeableness, speaks to one's level of cooperation, empathy, trust, and concern for others. Conscientiousness captures things like your self-discipline, how goals-orientated you are, your persistence, and your level of organisation. Emotional stability reflects calmness, resilience, rather than sort of anxiety and emotional volatility. And then we have a final category labelled openness to experience, which captures things like the level of your curiosity, the level of your imagination, intellectual engagement, and reception to new ideas. So as I say, these are 5 general traits that that are used as broad-based measures, but important to note that each trait reflects a whole range of different other criteria. But in general, sort of capture these general sort of patterns of thought and behaviour. Okay, so there is evidence that personality does change over the life course. So it certainly becomes more stable with age, but mean levels of personality continue to change across adulthood. And this can be related to environmental factors, which have been found to be particularly important for within-person changes. So, the environment in which one lives and engages every day can influence the rate of that change. There's also evidence to show that sort of adverse events, so whether they're job losses, employment shocks, or family breakdowns, and also sort of health shocks, can be associated with changes in personality. A lot of this literature is sort of looking at short time windows, and the effects have been relatively small. There is a literature that just focuses on health shocks, looking at different health conditions and different diseases and how they influence personality. But much of the evidence is sort of correlation-based, so it doesn't identify any sort of causal effects, which is an area that we try to contribute in this paper. And we also try and estimate the effects of a major health shock in permanent disability over time. So we try and do 2 things. We try and generate causal effects of disability onset on personality change, and we also try and document how that evolves over time from the time of onset of disability. So we make 3 sort of main contributions to this large sort of burgeoning literature. We capture permanent disability, which is a durable change in functioning and social participation. So as I'll speak about in a few more slides, that disability is not just a diagnosis of a health condition. It's related to how one can function within the surrounding environment. We adopt a difference in difference design, a staggered approach developed by Callaway Santana. which enables us to estimate cohort-specific and dynamic treatment effects. And we also try and capture this sort of the dynamics of this relationship using 24 waves of the HILDA survey. So we capture effects 4 years before and 4 years after onset. I mean, we can estimate effects beyond then, but the estimates are quite noisy, given that personality is only collected every 4 waves within the HILDA, rather than sort of every year. So we have disability information every year, but we only have information on personality every 4 years, which influences our sample size. So one can argue that permanent disability is a distinctive test of personality malleability. So the way we think about disability, and certainly how it's conceptualized in the ICF, the International Classification of Functioning, from the WHO, and also if we look at definitions of disability in the International Convention on the Rights of People with Disability, for example, and also the measure of disability within the HILDA survey, it's defined according to this sort of dynamic relationship between a health condition, disruption in terms of activity limitations and restricted participation, and then how that those restrictions then flow on to changes in terms of one's role, whether it be work, social contact, independence, and daily routines. So disability, by definition, captures the broader sort of effects of a health condition upon one's sort of functioning in society, whether it be through work or schooling or general sort of interactions and daily activities. So a permanent shift in the environment is precisely the setting in which adult personality should be most likely to change. Okay, and we argue in the paper that permanent disability is a very good example of that permanent sort of shift in the environment. There's also a bit of a literature that helps us think a little bit about how a major health shock, such as a disability, might actually flow on to a change in personality. So if you like, we can think of these as sort of pathways or mechanisms by which disability onset might influence personality. So Jokela and colleagues identify 3 sort of broad pathways. So this sort of pathway they define as distress, so coping with the initial diagnosis of a major health shock, the uncertainty of one's health and what that means for the future, and also sort of losing control, I suppose, and associated with that loss of certainty. And the prediction is that can lead on to sort of lower emotional stability. Secondly, fatigue, pain, lethargy, and reduced positive energy, can go on to lead to lower levels of extroversion and conscientiousness. And then we also have, the scope for sort of reduced work and social participation, which can lead to lower extroversion. And it's also possible that one would adapt to this new state and, new sort of restricted functioning. And we may actually see some sort of changes in terms of levels of openness as people adapt to their new environment, I guess, given by their health condition. So in this paper, we try and test these 3 mechanisms. So I think that's one of our contributions, is that we try and identify why it is that disability is leading to personality change. Okay, so I mentioned earlier that we're using the Household Income Labour Dynamics Australia survey. And since its inception in 2001, it's included a measure of disability, which is defined as any long-term health condition, impairment, or disability that restricts people or the respondent in everyday activities and has lasted or is likely to last for 6 months or more. So as I mentioned earlier, the definition of disability is the coexistence of a health condition that restricts functioning. And the other criteria is that it is long-term. And we can see that here, that the health condition must have lasted for 6 months or more. So respondents are asked this question. They're then asked to classify the particular impairment that they have. So they're shown a card of various impairments, and we use this to group the impairments into 3 categories of disability types. So we have sensory, physical, and psychosocial disability. So we look at how onset of these different disability types, how they affect changes in personality. And then respondents are then asked as to whether their condition limits the type or amount of work that they can do. So we use 24 waves of the HILDA, so 2021 to 2024. The panel is representative at the national level. As I mentioned earlier, we only have personality information every 4 waves, so we have a more restricted sample. So our analysis sample is still quite large, 118,550 odd observations. So that's person wave observations. We collect the personality information is collected every 4 years from 2005, and that's measured on a scale from 1 to 7, 7 being the highest level of that particular trait. And respondents could report up to 5 personality observations over the period of our study, which I mentioned is 2021 to 2024. We focus on permanent onset of disability, so that is people that reported no disability in one wave and then in a subsequent wave reported disability and then disability throughout the remainder of the survey. And the reason for doing this is because we wanted to, I guess, capture people that had a long-term experience with disability, perhaps that captured more severe or sustained levels of disability. And these are also the people, I suppose, that would qualify for government supports and also non-government supports. So there's also a technical reason for doing this, that a lot of the new difference in difference estimators require this sort of, I guess, permanent treatment, sort of, so where it's off to on permanently throughout the remainder of the panel. But there is quite a bit of churn in disability, so there's quite a lot of people coming in and out of reports of disability. But as I say, we restrict our sample to those people that report disability consistently throughout the sample. As I mentioned earlier, we classify 3 broad types of disability. So sensory disability, so they're people that report to have sight problems that are not corrected by glasses or lenses, hearing problems or speech problems. Physical disabilities are those that are related to limited use of arms and fingers or feet and legs, difficulty gripping, migraines, restrictions on physical activity or work, disfigurement or deformity, breathing difficulty, chronic or recurring pain. And we have a final category of psychosocial disabilities, which contain to nervous or emotional conditions that require treatment and mental illness requiring help or supervision. One thing to note is that we define these at the year of onset and we carry them forward, and that people could report more than one disability type. So the categories are not mutually exclusive. There are a number of other impairments on the list that we didn't classify, such as blackouts or fits, learning difficulty, head injury, stroke or brain damage, and other long-term conditions. But these 3 categories and associated impairments and health conditions capture the vast majority of people's reported impairments. So the great thing about the HILDA is, and we have a relatively small sample, but we have rich information. So we have a great measure of disability that reflects, contemporary classifications and definitions of disability that's been running since 2001. So it's quite unusual to have, over 20 years of disability information. And alongside that, we've also got extensive other health measures, so notably the SF36, which contains various dimensions of health. So we use these other domains to explore the pathways that potentially could lead from disability onset to personality change. So we look at mental health, which captures sort of psychological distress and well-being, vitality, which measures energy and fatigue, bodily pain, which is pain intensity, and also pain-specific interference with normal work, social functioning, interference or physical or emotional problems with social activities, role physical, which is sort of broader limitations in work and daily activities caused by physical health. And we also use the general health measure, which captures sort of general overall health perceptions and expectations about future health. So in these SF36 domains, the scores range from 0 to 100. And once again, these are aggregated domains that capture a large number of other components. And the higher scores indicate better health or functioning. Okay, so here's our analysis sample. So we've collected some reporting or displaying some demographic characteristics. So one thing I should have mentioned is that we restrict our sample to adults, so aged 18 to 64. And that's because personality is much more stable through adulthood. As people enter elderly ages, then we see more change. So we're strictly focusing on the working age population, 18 to 64. Around 54% of our sample, or the person year observations are female, and around 36% have a university degree. In terms of our definition of permanent disability, around 9% of the sample report a permanent disability. And in terms of the disability types, physical disabilities are most prevalent at around 4%, followed by psychosocial, and then sensory disabilities. As I mentioned earlier, there are other impairments that we don't include. And then moving forwards, looking at the personality traits, you can see here that on average, levels of agreeableness, conscientiousness, and emotional stability are higher than what we see for levels of extroversion and openness to experience. I don't know if that's consistent across countries, but that's what we're seeing within our Australia data. And we've also got means and standard deviations for our other health measures given by the SF36. Okay, so just going to show you now, this is just the raw data looking at the disabled population. So just restricting the sample now to those people that report permanent disability onset. And we can see here that that 0 and the vertical line or dashed line denotes the year of the onset, and each point beyond or before that is the year relative to onset. So just looking at the descriptive trends, which is just the average personality trait at each year relative to onset, we can already see that there does appear to be some sort of change in the pre and post period. I guess the thing that sort of jumps out here is that extroversion is really quite stable before onset and then takes a fairly gradual kind of deep dive. Conversely, we can see that agreeableness seems fairly flat over the pre and post onset period. We also see declines for conscientiousness and emotional stability, whereas openness to experience is almost like displaying a bit of an upward trend. The thing to note here is that, as I say, we're just restricting this to the disabled sample. So in order to estimate the impact of disability on these outcomes, we really need to think about an appropriate control group. So we need to think about, what would have happened to those people if they didn't experience disability onset. How would their personality have changed over time? So that's essentially what we do with our estimator. We use a staggered difference in difference design. So basically what we do is we just compare the changes in personality for people that experience disability onset with a control group that includes those people that never experience a disability or those that haven't yet experienced a disability at that particular time point. Obviously, with this sort of setup that people can experience disability onset at different times, so we have this sort of cohort by time comparison. So at each event time, so that's like the year to onset, the relevant cohort-specific effects are combined. And then we just combine those event time cohort-specific effects into an average post effect. So each of these sort of cohort by time effects is, we can think about it as like a group level difference in difference comparison. So these are not individual level difference in difference comparisons, but these are at the group level. So just to make this a little bit more concrete, to give you a bit of an example. So this personality was first measured in 2005 in the HILDA, and then every 4 years subsequently. So we have personality information in 2005 and 2009. And disability onset is observed annually. So let's say we have someone who experienced onset in 2008, okay? So that would be, and then we observe personality in 2009. So for this particular cohort, we would be estimating a 1 year post-onset effect. So essentially, we compare the change in personality from 2009 to the previous wave, which is 2005, for the person that experiences onset. And then for the comparison person, we compare the equivalent change over the same period of time, so 2009 to 2005. Okay, so that would give us a cohort-specific effect for the event time 1 year post-onset. Another example is that if someone experienced onset in 2007, again, we're observing personality in 2009. So we're observing personality 2 years after onset. And for this person, we're comparing, once again, the change from 2009 to 2005. And we find a similar person, 2009 to 2005, and this would give us our estimate 2 years post-onset. Now, in order to argue that this is an appropriate causal effect, we're assuming that that essentially I guess the counterfactual trend, so the event that someone didn't experience a disability, then the change in the outcome from 2005 to 2009 would have been the same as the control person who didn't actually experience a disability over that period. So this assumption is known as the parallel trend assumption, which is the key kind of identifying assumption. We also assume that there's no anticipation. So there's no anticipation that one will develop a disability, and that might start affecting one's personality before they actually report having a disability. That would also violate our causal effect. And we also assume a stable treatment definition. So we assume that that disability is measured in the same way, which it is over the survey, and that people remain treated or remain disabled over the treatment period. So we can't directly test this parallel trend assumption because we never know what would have happened to that person if they didn't experience disability onset. But there are things that we can do. We run some checks before onset. So we examine whether the difference in the outcomes are the same. The difference in the outcomes are similar for people with and without onset prior to the onset. We also look at the dynamic nature of the effects, so we can see how the effects are changing over time. And we also estimate a range of difference in difference estimators just to ensure that our effects are not just picking up effects related to the particular estimator that we use. So we estimate 4 or 5 different difference in difference estimators, and we find that our results are largely consistent. Okay, so I might just move on to the main results now. So these are our baseline sort of headline results here. We can see that, again, we've got this on the x-axis, we've got 0 denoting obviously no change relative to the control. And we can see that for emotional stability, conscientiousness, and extroversion, that there are large negative effects for those people that experience disability onset. So this is an average over all of the post-treatment periods. And we can see that those effects are around 0.23 to 0.28 of a point. And these personality traits are measured on a 1 to 7 scale. And for those of you that were attentive to the descriptive statistics, we can see that for these personality traits, the standard deviation is around 1. So these effects for pretty much all of the traits are roughly 1. So these effects in terms of standard deviations are around 1/5 to 1/4 of a standard deviation in size, which is quite sizable. And interestingly, we don't observe any statistically significant effects on openness to experience and the level of agreeableness. Openness to experience is in fact positive, but as we can see, the confidence intervals are crossing 0, so you don't have any confidence that that effect is statistically different from 0. And we see very small effects on agreeableness. So in summary, the results suggest that fairly large effects on extroversion, possibly due to less sociability, conscientiousness, possibly due to less sort of goal-directedness, persistence, and quite large effects again on emotional stability, potentially reflecting more distress and emotional volatility. We don't see any significant changes in the level of agreeableness and openness to new experience. Looking at the effects over time from the year of onset, we can see that for extroversion, conscientiousness, and emotional stability, that we can see that for each of these, that the effects are not are rapid and large. We can see that there's like a gradual decline over time. And similarly for agreeableness and openness to experience, we can see that those coefficients are pretty flat over the treatment effect period. So that's 4 years before treatment being onset, and then 4 years post. Reassuringly, we don't actually see any differences in statistical differences in the pre-treatment period, the pre-onset period, which gives us some confidence that our parallel trend assumption holds. But we see, diversions, from the year of onset. So with extroversion, we see a dip in the year of onset, similarly for conscientiousness, and then emotional stability sort of, falls more gradually over time with a large decline by year 4. But we can see there with the size of the confidence intervals that point estimate is estimated less precisely. So I guess what we can take away from this is that, first of all, that coefficients fluctuate around 0, supporting the parallel trend assumption, and that's for all 5 of the personality traits. That effects emerge and deepen unevenly over several years. The gradual divergence is more consistent with an accumulating response to disability rather than a sort of one-off reaction. Okay, so I'll move on now to look at how the average effects, so this is the post-treatment averages, how they vary across different groups. So as I mentioned earlier, we classify people in terms of disability type, sensory, physical, and psychosocial. We also look at how the effects vary according to gender, age, so that's people 45 years and under, and then over 45. And then by the level of education, so whether people have a university degree or not. I'm not sure how clear this is to you, how good your eyesight is, but we can see some quite clear patterns emerging. So if we just focus on the three traits where we see the largest effects, so extroversion, conscientiousness, and emotional stability. In terms of disability type, we see psychosocial disabilities having much more adverse effects, much larger effects than the other types. We don't actually see much of an effect for sensory disability. We see sort of moderate effects for physical disabilities, but much larger effects for psychosocial. Interestingly, we also observe differences according to gender. So men seem to be more impacted across all three of these. So we see larger negative effects for men for extroversion, conscientiousness, and emotional stability. As we can see, the error bars are overlapping. So we have to be a bit cautious about making these sorts of statements, but certainly it does appear that men are more adversely affected by disability in terms of their change in personality. And we also see larger negative effects for younger people, with older people not really experiencing the same level of negative effects at all. So we can see quite very large effects for people under 45 for extroversion, whereas those effects are much smaller and are not statistically significant for the older group. And then the other quite interesting observation is that people without formal university qualifications also experience much larger negative effects, and we don't actually see any significant effects for people with university degrees. So it seems to be quite a large disparity according to education level. So just in summary, I realise there's a lot going on in those graphs, so it's a bit difficult to take it all in, but I think the takeaways are that psychosocial disability produces the broadest adverse pattern. Physical disability lowers extroversion and conscientiousness, while sensory disability shows no clear personality effect. In terms of age, onset at 45 or younger is associated with changes across 4 traits. After 5, we only see a change for conscientiousness. Men's response is much more adverse than women's. Yet the other interesting thing to note is that men experience a positive effect on openness to experience, and that effect is statistically different from 0, and is also relatively large, so about 0.228, I think, of a standard deviation. And then non-graduates show declines in extroversion, conscientiousness, and emotional stability, with graduates showing no clear change in personality traits. Okay, if we map this now to our SF36 domains, once again, there's a lot going on here. My apologies. I think Leanne mentioned that she's going to share the paper, so we're happy to share the working paper with you if you want to sit down and digest this graph a little more. But once again, we estimate the average effect for the full sample, and then across all the different subsamples denoted by personality type, gender, age, and then level of education. Interesting to note that for vitality, bodily pain to a lesser extent, and certainly for general health, we actually see pretty consistent negative effects across the different subsamples. So even though people with sensory disabilities are experiencing large reductions in their general health and levels of vitality, we don't actually see that translating to changes in personality. Whereas if we look at the level of social functioning and also physical roles, so that is roles that are affected by reductions in physical health, we can see similar patterns emerging to what we saw in the heterogeneous effects, where we see larger effects in general for people with psychosocial disabilities, for men for younger people and for university non-educated people. So I think there's a few clues there as far as sort of informing what might be sort of driving some of these underlying effects. So just to summarise, mental health, vitality and general health deteriorate broadly among groups with little measured personality change. What aligns more closely with our personality change effects are men, younger onset respondents and non-graduates have larger losses in role, physical and social functioning. And that, in terms of disability types, that psychosocial disability produces the largest mental health response, which I guess is expected. So impairment type also matters. And what also appears to matter is disruption to roles, routines, and social participation may translate a common sort of health shock into a personality change. Let's see how am I going for time. Okay, so yeah, as I mentioned earlier, we ran a number of robustness checks. So in the first column here, we repeat our pooled average post-treatment effects using the Callaway and Santana estimator. The thing to note here is we use this because each specification has 5 different outcomes, personality outcomes, then we include Q values here, which essentially allow for this sort of multiple outcome hypothesis testing, and our results are largely unchanged. We also estimate a pre-treatment average effect just to investigate the parallel trends further. We can see that the pre-average effect for extroversion is significant at the 10% level, so the p-value is 9.6%. But once again, once we adjust for the multiple hypothesis testing, then that effect is no longer significant. So seems that our pre-treatment trends are equivalent across treatment and control groups. We then also estimate the traditional two-way fixed effects estimator, which has been shown to be biased in these sort of staggered difference in difference designs. And we can see that the effects are kind of very similar, slightly smaller in size. So we see larger negative effects for extroversion, conscientiousness and emotional stability. In particular, the effects for conscientiousness are larger, and we don't see any significant effects for openness to experience and agreeableness. We also use the Chase-DiMartin estimator, where the effects are even in the 5th column here, the effects are even larger than what we estimate, so up to 0.43 of a standard deviation on extroversion. Conscientiousness result is slightly smaller than what we estimate, so 0.19 compared to our baseline estimate of 0.27. And again, much larger effects for emotional stability at 0.332. We also use an imputation approach in column 4, and we can see that again the results are fairly consistent with what we observed, that there are larger negative effects on extroversion, conscientiousness and emotional stability. Okay, so just in terms of summing up, what are our sort of key takeaways? The permanent disability onset is followed by gradual meaningful declines in extroversion, conscientiousness and emotional stability. Because these traits shape participation, persistence and emotional regulation, their decline may amplify later disadvantage across work, health and social life. So that is, personality change may be one mechanism through which the initial disability shock produces lasting social and economic disadvantage. And we provide some suggestive evidence that disrupted work roles, routines, and social participation may contribute to the personality response. Okay, so I think I'll leave it there. I see that we've got about 15 minutes remaining, so happy to hear any thoughts or questions. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Michael. Very interesting presentation. I've got a couple of questions. One's from Sarah, who has a query about what model of disability you have utilised within your research, whether it's a medical model, social model, or human rights model.
Great question. Yeah, thank you. I would say that it's probably a human rights based approach. I mean, we're using the questions in the HILDA, so we're somewhat restricted in terms of the model, but we argue that that the measure broadly sort of captures how we think about disability in terms of the international classification of functioning, the WHO classification of functioning, disability and health, which is the sort of the conceptual framework upon which we now think about disability, which has been influenced heavily by the social model of disability. So I would say that that I guess to answer your question, that I think our measure of disability is more closely aligned with the social model. So it's how a health condition or impairment interacts with the environment. So it's not necessarily whether you have a disability, have an impairment per se, but it's how accommodating your environment is as to whether you report a disability. So if you live in an accommodating environment where that impairment isn't reduced, the functioning associated with that impairment isn't reduced, then one can argue that there isn't a recorded disability. So I think the question is probably reflects the ICF and the International Convention, which is more of a hybrid approach. So sort of a hybrid approach between the social model and the medical model, because it interacts the health condition with the functioning and the social environment, whereas the social model doesn't recognize the medical model. So anyway, I know somewhat. I've written on this, and I know a little bit about these models, but my understanding is that the ICF and the International Convention adopt a hybrid approach, which adopts concepts of the medical and also the social model.
Thanks, Michael. A question from Kit, who's curious how your paper addresses research and evidence gaps between men, women, and different disabilities, given women have historically been excluded from most medical research until 1993, and also minority groups also have historically been excluded in research in favour of funding go-to-majority areas.
Thank you. Yeah, another great question. Yeah, so we've done our best to look at how inequalities vary by gender. So I think that's like a really interesting aspect of the work, that we tend to observe larger negative effects for men, which is interesting in itself, and that may be because the sort of reductions in physical roles may be more appropriate for men. So we have to dig a little bit more deeply here, but I think we've done our best in the paper to try and see how disability onset affects different groups of people, in particular looking at gender, but also looking at different disability types, acknowledging that disability is not homogeneous, it's highly heterogeneous. So the experience of disability is very individual and is intersecting with gender and type and one's lived environment. So there's a lot to do, but there's only so much one can do in one paper. But we've tried to look at how these inequalities vary across dimensions of gender, age, education, and also disability types, so characteristics of disability. And we're also going to look at the severity of disability. So I think that's on the agenda, because the question also asks people what is the level of their work limiting disability. So we can also see how the impacts on personality change according to the severity of the disability itself.
Thanks, Michael. We've got time for one last question. And Paul, I'm going to throw it to you. There's another couple of questions in the chat, and we'll get Michael to answer those offline. Paul? Your microphone, Paul.
Great paper, Michael. I'm sorry I missed the beginning. One of the great things about HILDA is that you can look at cohorts, the 20-year-old in 2001, the 20-year-old in 2017, etc. And you're looking at time as well. So that brings up the question of, these big shifts that have occurred in disability support, very much so NDIS. And this might be a separate paper later on, but to what extent do we see any kind of structural breaks in the relationships with particularly NDIS. Disability support pensions have been fairly stable throughout this period, I believe. But the nature and level of support has changed dramatically, obviously, around the NDIS. And so it'd be fascinating to view that. And I'm not up with the latest HILDAs, so I don't know the extent to which you actually have questions on HILDA in there. But in a sense, it doesn't matter too much because you have this break, around 2013, 2014, and how that figured in terms of impacts.
Yeah, I mean, this is a great point. Again, I think one thing we were concerned about was COVID, of course, as well. So, as you say, there's a real, dramatic, change in policy around disability in Australia, which is a great thing, seeing the NDIS coming into effect. But in our model, so we control for year fixed effects and also for person fixed effects. So, I guess sort of they're differencing out, capturing some of those sort of year level changes that you mentioned. So it's something I guess we can think a little bit more about. We can maybe see, my understanding is, I looked into this years ago, but there's only, I mean, in sort of earlier waves, there weren't that many people that reported to be on the NDIS and the DSP as well. So we could maybe look at how welfare support might be a buffer to some of these sort of adverse effects that we observe. So that might be another conditioning criteria that we look at, is whether people are receiving support from the government in terms of the disability support pension or additional support through the NDIS. That would be interesting to look at, to see how those effects vary for those people that are receiving the support versus those that aren't.
Thanks, Michael, and thanks, Paul,
Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, thanks everyone. We will be sending out the slides for anyone who has joined us today or who has registered. Thank you again, Michael, and everyone enjoy your day. Thank you.
Thanks everyone. Thanks for coming.